Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Good morning, America, and to those listening around the world. This is Rich Sheaben, sitting in for Vince Finelli, broadcasting from Northwest Montana. Hope everybody's hanging in there and doing well today. And I'll be interviewing Dr. Norm Shealy, our American treasure, here on GCN and USAPrepares.com. Dr. Shealy, are you with us?
I am there and here.
Awesome. It's such an honor to always interview you, sir. And I want to send a thank you to Jason in Minnesota, who's engineering the broadcast, pardon me. And Dr. Shealy, I cannot tell you how much stress, anxiety. I mean, you look at all the, you've heard me use the terminology, the unit of measures of despair. The suicides, the drug overdoses, I've gone into quite a bit of detail and specificity. We all know what they are, and they're not going in the right direction. But, when you really look at what's happening, people can see that we're not fighting for socialism. We're fighting for the elite to create a totalitarian, tyrannical, communist insurrection against the people for their addictions of power, money, and control, and mostly also for the purpose of hiding crimes. There's a nurse, I don't know if you saw or heard her on the internet. I mean, there's so many whistleblowers coming out. I mean, if I broadcasted 5 days a week, Dr. Shealy, and gave 5 minutes to each whistleblower, I wouldn't even come close to covering 50% of the whistleblowers out there. But people are concerned. There's an RN, I think she's out of Florida, but she whistleblowed out of New York when they needed some extra help. Her name is Erin. I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name. It's spelled something like OLSZEWSKI. And Nurse Erin, if you're listening, I apologize for not being able to pronounce your name. But she's talking about, Dr. Shealy, about things like, how doctors are turning into executioners and followers, and if they don't follow orders, they get fired. She's using terms like, and this is regarding the vaccinations, the mRNA vaccinations that we've talked about. She's using terms like mass genocide. She has videos that has proved murder, and I'm quoting and paraphrasing her. This is regarding COVID and the vaccines. So, and I'm gonna dovetail that with an article here. California doctor said he was fired as a trauma medical doctor for John Muir Health, after writing a letter to health officials in California, which he challenged the local coronavirus restrictions. And there's a doctor out of Oregon, I think his name is Dr. Latulipi, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly as well. But Dr. Shealy, my question to you, when you hear about diagnosticians, nurses, healthcare workers who are in the front lines, seeing the crippling autoimmune diseases and side effects and adverse events, contraindications that's happening. Then you see doctors being fired if they don't follow orders. This is almost like Gestapo, Nazi type stuff. I mean, what's your reactions? What's your advice? What's your solutions, Dr. Shealy, when you hear?
Well, I gave up working for the system in 1967. And I've never worked, well, I did. I worked for a major clinic and I gave up working that system. And I worked under a hospital and I gave up working for that system. In other words, in my opinion, the entire medical system is as crooked as the government. I wrote a book called Third Party Rape some years ago. And the third party is the hospitals, the medical insurance mafia, the legal profession, and the government all working in cahoots. They are all bad, evil, part of the evil empire.
So would you recommend, Dr. Shealy, would you recommend individual physicians, and when I was a pharmaceutical rep, the independent physician was, when I first started back in the early 80s, working for the generic outfits, it was not uncommon to see people hanging up a shingle with an MD or a DO or a PA or LPN or something that was a legal diagnostician on their door. And today, it's almost suicidal to become an independent physician without liability and hospital support. So are you recommending that individual physicians break away and try to go back to hanging a shingle?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, I have not worked under a hospital, well, for 50 years almost.
When you hear this nurse, who she worked in the Middle East under war conditions, extremely brave, you listen to her, she's extremely eloquent in speech, extremely well-researched, and she's using terms like doctors don't follow orders, they're going to be fired, executioners, hiding crimes, mass genocide. To me, this shows that evidence-based medicine is not dying, it's dead. And now we have payoffs and money, and it's basically politics-based medicine. How do you respond to that, and how does the average person manage confidence in the system when they go to one of these physicians who have hospital-based support, or even go to a hospital for a diagnosis or a prognosis, or even some type of surgery, or any kind of healthcare advice? I mean, what do people think, and what's your advice to people like that?
Well, in acute illness, you don't have a choice. There are times when you absolutely need acute medicine at an emergency ward or a hospital. And it can save your life. And, on the other hand, 21% of all people hospitalized have some kind of complication that is not part of their disease. So you only have a 21% chance of getting a bad reaction to being in the hospital. But it can save your life, so you have to take the chance. Once it becomes chronic, and to me, officially, chronic is 6 months. But if you're not 50% better or more within 3 months, conventional medicine is not going to work, and I think you'd go elsewhere. Almost anywhere is better.
Dr. Shealy, I think that's one of the most profound statements you've made. You've mentioned that statement to me in different ways with the same meaning several times, and I've used that when being on radio shows or even monologuing by myself. And I think that's something that most people need to memorize, at least in the sense that if you start off with some type of trauma or acute whatever, and it turns in 6 months into chronic, and you're taking big pharma, synthetic medication, in 6 months, I remember you telling me that medicine is going to start to kill the patient. Did I overstate that?
Almost understated.
Oh, okay.
Because it can start to get you long before 6 months. On the other hand, definitely after 3 to 6 months, the time has come to look elsewhere.
Okay. Now, you've also heard me talk about how Big Pharma manages symptoms for profits. They don't care about cures. You've heard me talk about how managing symptoms for profits is also synonymous to liability, accountability, or no liability, accountability, pardon me, or in other words, liability immunity. I've mentioned those terms many times, where the medications are not designed to cure the people, just to create profits for the shareholders and the big corporations of Big Pharma itself. And how do you, as a doctor who's been practicing for 64 years, which is amazing in itself, so you don't just have the education, you don't just have the CME to keep up your education, but you've been a diagnostician for 64 years. How do you, when you look at other physicians, I don't want you to name names, but when you see these physicians literally selling out to the medical tyranny narrative because they feel they're going to lose their license, they're going to get fired, whatever. In other words, they're ignoring their Hippocratic oath today. How do you, as a physician who's independent, who's willing to help people and not put the hospital acquired ring and for cheaper liability insurance, how do people like you who are independent look at the medical field today, Dr. Shealy, regarding what I just mentioned?
Well, it sucks, and I'm being kind. Let's face it. In my opinion, I do not know not one single chronic disease of any kind whatsoever for which I would even consider, let alone allow in my own body, a chronic medicine. And that's the top of the iceberg. But I can tell you, back in the late 70s when I founded the American Holistic Medical Association, I spoke at a number of medical schools. And in the first year, 30% of the students were very interested in holism. By the senior year, it was 10%. By the time they finished their residency training, it's less than 1%. In other words, it's called brainwashing. If you're brainwashed for 7 or 8 years, you change a lot. I mean, it's not a 1-year process. It's 4 years to start with, and then it leads to another 3 or 4 after that.
Now, Dr. Shealy, I'm sure you remembered me saying this. The AMA is owned by Big Pharma. Is that an accurate statement?
That's being kind.
Well, I'm being kind and underestimating everything I was hoping to overestimate. So that, I guess my point is made. Folks, we'll be right back with Dr. Norm Shealy. We appreciate you being here. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. This is Rich Sheaven sitting in for Vincent Finelli today, and I'm with Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, I'm not really big on getting physicals and going to the doctor. And I know I should be. I do it every few years. Pardon me, that wasn't for effect. But, I had about a year ago, I had a PSA test, and I know how inaccurate they can be. And it came out to be over 25. And diagnostician said, "Oh my gosh, I think you have prostate cancer, and you better get a biopsy. You better do this. You better do that." And I'm sitting there. There's no freaking way. And I realize you can be asymptomatic in the early stages, but anyway, a week later, I went to a different location. This was in Kalispell, in the Flathead, here in northwest Montana. And my number turned out to be 1.4. So I called them up, and they didn't even call me up. They didn't even tell, oh, by the way, when you were here for a few days, the machine broke. And the reason why I'm saying this, folks, is because I think they found out I was on national radio, and they sent me my money back for the test. It wasn't much, but it's just hilarious that there's basically very little accountability in the medical field today. It's kind of like, and I'm looking at an article right now, where 22 highly renowned scientists conclude that the PCR tests, of course, for COVID-19, the China virus, produces 97% false positives. And, people in some of the tweets here I'm seeing is confirmed the pandemic is a hoax, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we all know it's a virus, but when you look at mortality rates, especially with morbidities, it's nothing worse than the regular flu. And the timing was very obvious to create the agenda, including try and steal the election, and that's yet to be determined. So my point is, regarding testing, I know people who are paranoid hypochondriacs, Dr. Shealy, and they'll get X-rays, they'll get MRIs, they'll get CAT scans, they'll go to voodoo people and do the ooga booga thing. Even the Coca-Cola tests positive for COVID-19 for the Austrian parliament. Papayas and fruits and goats were all testing positive for this. Whether it's regarding a PSA test or a COVID-19 test, how paranoid should people be, Dr. Shealy, regarding the accuracy of some of these tests?
I wish I had an answer to that one, Rich. Nothing, not one statement that I'm aware of in this entire pseudodemic has been has been correlated with everybody else. In other words, there are 2 to 10 different answers on every question that you can ask. And so it's fakery, fraud, false, and we don't know. So if you have symptoms and you have specific tests that show something is wrong, then it needs to be checked out by a physician to find out whether the test itself is accurate or whether or not you really have the problem. Now, sometimes there's no test to correlate with it, and you just have to go on clinical judgment.
Sometimes it's very hard, Dr. Shealy, when you look at the term official authority, and I use this in quotes, and I use the term experts in quotes also. It doesn't depend on your degree. It depends on your weakness and your willingness to sell out the American people for some money to be thrown in your back pocket for a certain narrative. And unfortunately, I'll use this example. I have an article here from the Gateway Pundit, and it's talking about Dr. Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx. And as you know, they've both been caught without their masks. Fauci had a ball game. Dr. Birx went to she just got done telling the whole world how dangerous this deadly pandemic was. And she was caught at one of her relatives' houses with 3 generations of people. Now she's retiring. You can't make this stuff up. I'll get into this article after the break, folks. We appreciate you being here. We'll be back with Dr. Norm Shealy. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. This is Rich Sheaven sitting in for Vincent Finelli, and I am interviewing Dr. Norman Shealy. Dr. Shealy, I started this one article from the Gateway Pundit talking about how Dr. Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx were basically using a fraudulent model to predict 2.2 million American deaths from this coronavirus pandemic by this time. And they used what's called this Imperial College model. And I'm kind of making this analogous to certain tests. And they met with President Trump so they can purposely shut down the economy. Obviously, none of this ever happened. And we now have empirical evidence that the World Health Organization, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, were not only all wrong, experts are calling them charlatans and liars. And the CDC quietly under the table, I think for liability protection, kind of redid their numbers to show that only 6% of coronavirus deaths were due to the coronavirus alone. Most of the deaths were very old Americans with comorbidities. And when you read this, Dr. Shealy, you have to realize that we've all been played. And it's really difficult for people, when they look at testing, when they look at models saying these things, what stance should the people take when they hear this stuff, Dr. Shealy?
Disbelief. I don't believe 1% of what I hear. First, second, and third, I think television sucks. It is part of the evil empire. I wouldn't trust them to tell me the time of day, let alone anything else. And Fauci is the greatest criminal alive other than George Soros and Bill Gates. But other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, the play goes on.
Yeah, there's a lot of quite disturbing information out there. Just like with now COVID, not to mention motorcycle deaths. I mean, I have a very sad article right here that shows an 82-year-old COVID patient was beat to death with an oxygen tank by his 37-year-old roommate because he was praying. I thought I'd mention that since you keep mentioning the word evil. And
well, anything that harms other people, in my opinion, is ultimately part of evil. You are not supposed to harm other people. That's, to me, a basic law. Not only are you supposed to help other people, you're definitely supposed never to harm them.
Well, I don't think anybody with any common sense and logic disagrees with that, Dr. Shealy. But when you look at COVID deaths, you look at pneumonia, influenza, and COVID, it's categorized as PIC, P-I-C, pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. And they're recategorizing deaths now. So the so-called 330,000 people that have died from that, so you take 6%, basically under 20,000 people, 19,800 deaths over this last year. And you have to remember, we lose in America between 7,000 and 8,000 people a day from all categories of mortality. And we have to remember the Johns Hopkins study that basically, and they removed the study because they got threatened. Johns Hopkins, a very elite, used to be honest institution. They removed their study examining COVID death rates where they said there's no difference in death rates between last year and this year. So it's very difficult for people to be confident in the system, Dr. Shealy. And, I mean, besides acute care, do you recommend people getting together and literally having maybe once a week meetings and reading and researching and discussing how to go forth and with recommendations on how to deal with certain disease states, Dr. Shealy?
Honestly, I doubt that it could be done. There are not enough honest people out there in the medical profession outside the box that would help them. So they have to make up their own mind.
You know, there's a couple of articles here. One's a video of a nurse who got Bell's palsy from the COVID vaccine, and she has facial paralysis. I believe she was out of Tennessee, and I just saw this video this morning, and it's going viral, like many, and I'm sure it's going to be kicked off of the system. Just like, you know, Twitter now says discussing vaccine dangers on Twitter is now prohibited. So they want to eliminate truth from the people. So when you see these nurses coming on really hoping, wishing, warning the people not to take this vaccine, and then you see social media like Twitter saying it's prohibited to tell the truth about vaccine dangers, this is very dangerous stuff, Dr. Shealy. I mean, how does the average person...
I think the entire social media is the greatest stupidity in the history of human race. That's just my opinion about Twitter and Facebook and all that nonsense. That is, I'd rather go suck dirt than watch that stuff.
Now, do you need to suck? If you're going to suck dirt, do you need a straw, or is that not indicated?
Oh, I think just plain old sandbox would do nicely.
You know, I can't tell you how many articles I've read, Dr. Shealy, about healthcare workers hospitalized after severe vaccination reactions. Different countries are now deploying resuscitation facilities where vaccination centers are.
They might as well
what does it take to wake the people up, Dr. Shealy? I mean, what do you do?
A guillotine.
Oh, boy. That's really scary. You know, here I have another article. Fauci lectures Americans over COVID-19. You're going to love this. Are you sitting down, Dr. Shealy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. He says it's spreading because we have too much freedom.
I would like to see him hanged in public square. That's just my personal opinion.
Well, and see, this goes back to the big government. You know, the powers that be want big banks, big government, big corporations to force vaccines on the people. And I've mentioned, I'm blue in the face talking about all the hypocrisies and double standards of these elitists who get caught at restaurants, going to family outings, going here, going on vacations. I mean, literally being surrounded by these 20 bikini beautiful women, and they're saying how dangerous the deadly pandemic is, and you should, you know, social distance and wear a mask. And all these people who are saying it aren't doing it.
And what about Chief Justice Roberts on an Epstein plane? That one's been around several times.
Oh, I know. I've read that. I have read that several times, and I just feel sorry for the people, because it's like you're either going to make a choice to be a follower or a thinker, and if you want to be a thinker, you have to do your own reading and research and think for yourself. I mean, Fauci just admitted. I read this several times. He's been lying to the American people about herd immunity. And even the World Health Organization just deleted their naturally acquired immunity from its website. Can you explain to the people about naturally acquired immunity and herd immunity, Dr. Shealy, so they can put what I just said in context, please?
The point is that a majority of people who actually encounter the virus develop immunity without being significantly ill. It's that simple. My neighbor, right across the street from me, who's lived there for, years and years and years, I see him once a week at least, he just became positive. I don't know how, I don't know where, but he wasn't sick. Now, of course, we also know that the tests are false as well, so he may not be positive after all, but he's now positive.
You know what's scary, Dr. Shealy, is you read, especially in these articles, sometimes in the comment section, that all these so-called experts have been so bought and paid for, or threatened or blackmailed to sell certain narratives. And, there's talk about different mutations and, our immune system going south. There's people who feel that these people who are so evil, now I'm going to use your term here, that they might literally release a bioweapon that's more powerful than this China virus that they delivered to the world in the last year. What's your thoughts on that?
Indeed, extremely possible. That's how bad the situation is.
You know, we've talked about Bill Gates before, you and I, about, and it's not just geoengineering bioweapons and viruses. He's talking about geoengineering particles that reflect the sun. We all know the damage that volcanoes have done in certain parts of the world in certain years where we had food shortages. And I can see unintended consequences, not just happening from vaccines, but Bill Gates' depopulation efforts as far as putting particles into the atmosphere to reflect sun from the earth. You know, getting rid of no combustion engines. I mean, eliminating food supply. I mean, I can see major death, major depopulation. And he's saying that even regarding with the COVID situation today, that through 2022, we should be prepared for life not, and I repeat, not to return to normal. This is a guy who's controlling us by fear. This is a guy who's lied. He was on video calling for COVID passports, and in a recent interview, he said, "No, I didn't." I mean, they're literally gaslighting the people, Dr. Shealy, and you know, I get a lot of questions of this context, and it's very difficult to trust the system and the so-called experts when we get this type of behavior. Any comment on that?
Well, considering how bad Microsoft Office Word or whatever it is, 10 is, how could you trust him on anything else? It's the greatest piece of mechanical crap ever developed. I'm about to convert to Apple.
Okay, we'll be right back, folks. Dr. Norm Shealy. Welcome back to the broadcast class. This is Rich Scheben sitting in for Vincent Finelli. And I'm interviewing Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, you know, I'm not trying to be negative about the government, but when you read these things about false, fraudulent models, you see the things, the hypocrisies about Fauci and Birx. You see overall believability of any so-called expert or government institution being an all-time low and corruption being an all-time high. I mean, here's just one example. In this new supposed coronavirus bill, which is a joke, it's basically for payoffs for favors that's been done in the past, money's going to different countries. I mean, our government even spent $4.5 billion to spray alcoholic rats with bobcat urine. And remember, years ago, there was $1 million spent on why American lesbians are so fat. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, people, our government would never do that. Well, there was a lawsuit filed the other day against educational agencies, teachers, principals, CEOs responsible for hosting workshops requiring children to make public professions about their racial, sexual, gender, and religious identities, some of which were singled out for interrogation. I mean, I think we've lost it, Dr. Shealy, and I think when I talk to people and I see the depression, the anxiety, again, all the units of measures of despair, even Minnesota, which is a very so-called liberal state, lawmakers are saying that the coronavirus deaths could be inflated by 40%, reviewing death certificates. Washington State said even more than that. I mean, how do you really? It's so. I know I keep asking a similar question a different way, but it's really difficult for the people to have confidence when you hear the Bill Gates of the world saying that this mRNA vaccination is an experiment and will change your DNA forever. I mean, what do people think and do, Dr. Shealy?
Well, the number one thing I do is detach. Who the hell cares? I don't mean to be rude. I just don't appreciate any source of activity today. I don't trust anyone enough to pay attention. I let it flow by, and I say, okay, I'm done. Bye-bye. I will not allow myself to be frustrated or worried or upset by nonsense. And I choose to call all mainline media and most other nonsense.
Yeah, and this is why you almost have to believe 180-degree opposite of what the mainstream media says. You know, here's another article in front of me about a 40-year-old Indian man being sued by the Serum Institute of India for going public with gory details about horrific side effects he experienced following the vaccination of the COVID-19. And he was participating in clinical trials for this COVID-19 vaccine when he suffered neurological and psychological breakdown from a series of jabs that left him in the hospital in the ICU for 15 days. And it was determined that the man had suffered from acute neural encephalopathy, a condition marked by an altered mental state that left him totally disoriented to the point where he was no longer able to be recognized by close family and relatives. And the powers that be, Dr. Shealy, wants us to take not just one vaccine, but multiple vaccines for a very long time. Can you tell the audience what neuroencephalopathy is and talk about immune disease and distress and define that for the people, for our class, please?
It means damage to the brain. And, of course, it could be any kind of damage you can imagine, from paralysis to malfunction in any form of or any organ in the body. So it can be extremely variable. The brain is the control center, ultimately. Secondly, the immune system is supposed to protect us from outside stuff. But if it goes crazy, it can cause all kinds of autoimmune diseases which can ultimately kill you or certainly cripple you in any organ in your body. So it's a wide variety of dysfunctions and illnesses that can be, placed under this tab.
You know, it mentioned in this article I just mentioned neurological and psychological breakdown where he wasn't even recognized by immediate family and relatives. These autoimmune diseases, these neurological diseases, it sounds like these vaccines could be also designed to reprogram our minds and not just change our DNA. Would you, after the break, Dr. Shealy, could you please address what I just mentioned about the reprogramming of the mind?
Oh, yeah.
That would be great. We appreciate everybody being here. We're with Dr. Norm Shealy. We'll be right back after the hard break at the top of the hour. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. This is Rich Sheeben from Montana, sitting in for Vincent Finelli today, and I am with Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, right before the hard break at the top of the hour, and now that we're in hour number 2, I would like you to mention in detail, because I talked about this 40-year-old man who was taking experimental COVID-19 vaccines. He just suffered neurological and psychological breakdowns. He was in the ICU for 15 days. He was diagnosed with neuroencephalopathy, and basically he was unable to recognize his own family and friends and close relatives. And I want you to go into more detail about neurological disease, autoimmune disease. This is not, even Bill Gates admitted that this will change your DNA forever. And I'm wondering, because of what I just mentioned about this neurological and psychological breakdown and encephalopathy, are we looking at having our minds reprogrammed where the powers that be could literally program an army? Dr. Shealy, your thoughts?
Well, let's face it. From the time you enter kindergarten school, you are being programmed one way or another. And mostly, overall, I think the educational system is fairly good. But once it gets to graduate school, it becomes more prejudiced in every field, I think. And there is something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, that can be any number of things, from depression to anxiety to other malfunctions or dysfunctions of the brain in any way whatsoever. So memory, of course, is one of those. It's one of our most important and useful tools. But losing your ability to think straight, losing your ability to be organized, losing your ability even to speak at all. My favorite example of that is a man 60 years of age who could not stand alone with two people holding him. He couldn't put his feet on the ground. He had that kind of severe brain disorder. It was called Parkinsonism. Now, in his case, we were able to reverse it by putting a gamma PEMF device on his head for a month, or several hours a day for the first month, and then he walked into the office. But it's not always reversible. Sometimes it causes a chemical or physical change in the brain. Now, we've known that the brain is plastic for many years. Sir John Eccles, with whom I worked back in the early 60s, specialized in what he called brain plasticity. So if you program the brain with physical exercises, mental impressions, etc., you can change brain function. And that's what happens in school. When we go through school, we fortunately are mostly programmed positively, but we can be programmed negatively. And if it's at all worrisome, it's going to be negative. Now, but ultimately, there's a little place called the hypothalamus. It's about in the size of the tip of your little finger on both sides, and it controls everything. It's sort of the control center. If it gets out of whack, everything can go wrong, from blood pressure to the immune system. And blood sugar and every hormone and every other chemical in your body can be disturbed. In the autoimmune, it can be very specific, like affecting only the thyroid, or only the ovaries, or only the testicles, or it can affect everything in your body. The immune system in general, like in rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and things like that. So all of these are malfunctions of the brain and the immune system combined most of the time. Any trauma can do it, and any, chronic, constant brain washing can do it. And it can be done chemically as well as psychologically. I don't know if I've said enough.
No, that's very well said, Dr. Shealy. In fact, you mentioned the term plastic and programming, and I'm going to respond to that regarding the psychological end of things and the plastic end of things. Here's an article right here. Lean Cuisine just recalled its food because of pieces of hard plastic in its food. Isn't that funny, huh? And,
it's sad.
Yeah, it is sad. And I think if we don't get proper nutrition, all these things that deal with the immune system, the antioxidants, I want a conversation about that before the show's over today, too. But a California judge orders video journalists to pay $13.6 million to Planned Parenthood. So basically, when video journalists went in there to prove that babies were being killed for their organs and organs were being harvested regarding late-term abortions, now you can't even tell the truth, and the judges are ordering journalists to pay fines to Planned Parenthood. And you talk about reprogramming your mind. It's really sad that we can't protect our young and old. We can't, if we follow the rule of law publicly, we're going to be fined or chastised or demonized in some way. Now, Dr. Shealy, regarding neurological disorders, why is autism today, in your opinion, up so high to, I read, even as high as 1 in 60 individuals, young people having autism today? When I was a child, I don't even know if I ever saw anybody with autism. What's your comment on that, sir?
Vaccination. There's no question that the very high, 50 some odd vaccinations by the time you get to 6 years of age, There's no question that has increased the incidence of autism.
Then how in the world could Big Pharma demand liability immunity with what's going on? I know that's probably more of a law question, but from a Hippocratic Oath perspective, how can doctors look at themselves in the mirror today and offer these vaccinations to people with all the side effects and adverse events and contraindications out there, and knowing that liability immunity is part of the equation, Dr. Shealy?
Well, they shouldn't. And of course, I don't call it Big Pharma. That's actually being kind. I call it the pharmaco mafia.
Yeah,
I think that's how bad it is.
Yeah, when I was working for the generic industry back in the early 80s, I remember Big Pharma using the term ethical all the time. You probably remember that, Dr. Shealy.
I don't know if they've ever been ethical.
Well, no, but they were always trying to program and hold the narrative by saying the generic industry wasn't ethical because they didn't have patents on it, and when the patent expired, the generic industry could create these drugs, But, I think Big Pharma, like you said, it really is a mafia, because here's an article right here. It's a pharmaceutical factory that manufactures hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, which has been so famous for curing and even prophylactic treatment against COVID. And yet this factory, I think it was in Taiwan, mysteriously bursted into flames and exploded. And who knows?
Couldn't happen to a better company. I wish they'd all explode.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but unfortunately this company was a manufacturer of hydroxychloroquine, so I think there could have been some more nefarious plots. Dr. Shealy, there's a study that just came out where 10 million Chinese, and I know we shouldn't believe anything that comes out of China for obvious reasons, but they found that asymptomatic spread, and that was in quotes, never existed for the COVID Chinese virus. Now, are they covering their butts because they spread the virus is in their name? Or what's your feeling regarding people who are asymptomatic? Should they have to social distance? Should they have to wear masks? Can you transmit these viruses if you're asymptomatic in general, Dr. Shealy?
Of course. If you've got the virus, you can transmit it. And if your immune system is weak, you can acquire it. Now, by the way, personally, you couldn't pay me to have hydroxychloroquine. It does carry some negative effects. But if you take adequate vitamin D3 and adequate vitamin C and adequate B complex, your immune system is protected better than with any drug in the history of the world.
We've talked about all the immune systems, the criteria that deals with the immune system, if you would. Inflammation, circulation, allergies, infection, detoxifications, cancers, tumors. Regarding inflammation, that seems to be the big one because it seems to be a very obvious underlying health problem for a lot of not just chronic illnesses, but even the beginning stages of acute illnesses as well. And it makes the body unable to heal with a state of chronic inflammation. So when you look at conditions like heart disease and diabetes and arthritis and cancer, what therapy, especially vitamins and possibly foods, do you recommend, Dr. Shealy, to fight inflammation?
Well, antioxidants. Antioxidants come from fruits and vegetables. Now, the recommended daily intake is a minimum of 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. That's a minimum, not an optimum. The optimal is 8 to 10 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. Now, personally, I start every day with at least 20 servings of fruits and vegetables in a powder. I prefer to not have to worry about whether or not I get 10 servings or whatever. I get 20 servings out of a package. And I've been doing something like this for well over a year. And I seem to be extremely healthy doing this. Now, that doesn't mean I don't get some fruits and vegetables as well. However, I don't have to worry about how many I take in because I've already had twice the optimal dose a day.
Now, when you talk about antioxidants, Dr. Shealy, that obviously they're cancer, tumor fighters, they're immune system boosters. What about products like glutathione?
Well, glutathione is something we can make in the body, but you can also take it as a supplement, and it's very safe, and again, infinitely safer than any vaccine in the world.
Okay. Are there any contraindications with regarding?
I don't know any contraindications to taking glutathione as a supplement.
Okay. Well, we'll be back with Dr. Norm Shealy after the break, folks. We appreciate everybody being here. We'll be back in a couple minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Rich Scheben from Montana, sitting in for Vincent Finelli today, and I am interviewing Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, you mentioned a few moments ago that if you took vitamin C, vitamin D, and a B complex, that's probably, in your opinion, the best way to keep your immune system healthy, to fight inflammation, to fight cancer and tumors. Now, can you get more specific? Like we've heard about vitamin D3 being very efficacious for cancers and tumors. We've heard about vitamin B12, B17. What's your opinion on getting more specific with more additions to your regimen?
Well, in an adult, I think if you weigh 140 pounds or more, you need 50,000 units of vitamin D3 once a week. If you weigh under 40 pounds, you need it 3 times a month for the 1st, 10th, and 20th of every month. Now, if you suddenly feel as if a virus is knocking at the door, then you take 150,000 units 3 days in a row. So 450,000 units in 3 days. That's very safe. I have not personally had any virus or cold active in my body in over 12 years because that's the regimen I'm on. Now, secondly, you need not just B12 and B7, all these other special. You need B1, B2, B3, and B6. Those are the basics. The brain especially needs B1, B2, B3, B6. And if you are an average human being, you need a minimum of 25 milligrams of all of the basic Bs and traces of a lot of other things. In vitamin C, you need a minimum of 2 grams a day. Now, if you take with it some MSM, methylsulfotamethane, 1 gram of that and 2 grams of vitamin C, that doubles the effectiveness of the vitamin C. So basically, those are the amounts that I recommend for all adults. And I could say in my grandchildren, for instance, back in their, before teens, I started them on 50,000 units of vitamin D once a month, as well as whatever children's vitamins they took.
Okay. Now, Dr. Shealy, regarding, we hear the term, and I mention the term, and I give specific examples when I talk about it, but not as in-depth as you do, obviously. But talking about immune stimulants versus immune suppressants. I use an example, immune suppressants being sugar, immune stimulants, especially when I talk about gardening on the air. I talk about, onions, garlic, cayenne pepper, hot peppers, ginger, horseradish, kale, cabbage family, things of that nature. Can you go into more detail and specificity on how to gain more natural immune stimulants versus keeping away and avoiding immune suppressants, Dr. Shealy?
Well, the immune suppressants are, of course, sugar, fructose, and artificial anything whatsoever. Substitutes in general are not healthy. Among the immune enhancers or stimulants, my favorite is actually turmeric or curcumin, an extract from turmeric. And it works better, by the way, if you take black pepper with it, or piperine. Piperine actually enhances many of the antioxidant benefits, not just curcumin or turmeric, but also even ginger, for instance, is stronger if you take it with the black pepper. Garlic and onion are superb. Of course, all the fresh green leafy vegetables are at the top of the list. My favorite is actually kale. For some reason, for many, many years, dwarf curly kale has been my favorite thing to grow in the garden, although I grow a wide variety of leafy vegetables. And broccoli, of course, is another excellent adjunct for the immune system. And it was made famous by George Bush because he didn't like broccoli.
Yeah, I love broccoli. That's one of my favorite foods.
Yeah.
Dr. Shealy, we'll be back with Dr. Shealy right after the break. We appreciate you all being here. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. This is Rich Shealy sitting in for Vincent Finelli, and I'm with Dr. Norm Shealy. And we're down to the last little less than half an hour to the show. And Dr. Shealy, we really appreciate you being here and answering all these questions for our class. Dr. Shealy, regarding, with all these increase in everything, neurological disorders, we talked about cancer, allergies, Alzheimer's, dementia, depression, diabetes. I've read where obesity accounts for, and obesity-related diseases / deaths. There's 40,000 per month that can be attributed to obesity. So regarding things like common sense things, nutrition, hydration, exercise, sleep, trying to reduce exposure to chemicals, what other criteria would you recommend in that group of common sense logical therapy to try to reduce your odds of getting some of these diseases, if you will? Well,
statistically speaking, at least 72% of Americans are overweight, with at least 36% of them plain fat. Officially, obesity is 40 pounds or more over your ideal weight, or a body mass index of 30 or above. And that is well over 32% of Americans who are just plain obese. It is sloppy eating and inactivity more than anything. And that sloppy eating is, sugar and carbohydrates and junk. And monosodium glutamate is one of them. White rice, regular potatoes, all boxed cereals, they're all junk. All fast food restaurants are pure junk. I wouldn't eat a cup of coffee. I wouldn't drink a cup of coffee at a McDonald's because I wouldn't trust them not to put monosodium glutamate in it. Monosodium glutamate is a poison to your brain bucket, and we don't need it. And of course, Chinese restaurants focus on white rice, which is the least food available. You might as well just eat a bowl of sugar. It's got that much nutrition in it. Nothing of value whatsoever. And they add monosodium glutamate, and you can't trust them to not put it in. So I often have said I'd rather cook for 30 people than eat out. And that was even before the pandemic. Because I don't trust restaurants any more than I trust, the food producers. In other words, I consider the food producers as evil as the tobacco industry. They do not necessarily provide you with real food.
You mentioned, I want to touch on potatoes and all these additives you just mentioned. I talked about MSG and aspartame, other artificial sweeteners. You mentioned nicotine indirectly, high fructose corn syrup. Do you think that these products, these additives, even propylene glycol, which is not just an additive, but it's basically an antifreeze, do you think that these were designed to be addictive in order to make people sicker for profits for the powers that be?
I wouldn't put it past them. I think it's stupidity more than it is greed in this situation. It's just lack of common sense and trying to make the things last longer without, worrying about normal decay with time. Food's not meant to last forever.
Speaking of food not lasting forever, and you mentioned potatoes a few moments ago, I've read where potatoes are sprayed with chemicals to slow down budding shoots and rot, so it stays on the shelf longer. Not to mention the fact that a lot of them have been radiated, which destroys nutrition and vitamins, but yet there's federal laws that protect potato farmers from the people revealing this information. I mean, there should not be liability immunity with that type of stuff, Dr. Shealy.
Well, federal government sucks. It's part of the evil empire at every level, as far as I can tell. It's gotten more so in the last 100 years.
Now, what's your opinion, doctor, on a lot of these so-called diseases, bacteria that you find in restaurants and even grocery stores like Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria? Is that becoming more of an issue? Should people cook their... If people, unlike someone like myself that lives off the land, that raises animals to harvest, that has a garden, that hunts and fishes, let's face it, 95% of people don't live, and I'm being very gracious with that number, don't live off-grid and live the way I do. Do you think regarding these bacterias and low standards and expectations of our foods with all the chemicals in it, the artificial sweeteners, the addictive additions, do you think, what recommendations you have to that 95% of people who don't have the ability or desire or skill set to harvest their own food? Dr. Shealy.
Well, my top of my list, of course, is something like 75% of people in this country do live in a house rather than in an apartment. And if you live in a house, you've likely got some small bit of lawn. And it's no more work to plant a garden than it is to mow your lawn. So I have, for 50 years, recommended if you live in a place where you've got some kind of lawn, you can raise most of your vegetables right there in your own yard. So that's always at the top of my list. Other than that, in those cities where it's possible, you might try to find a farm market, but see what you can learn about them before you trust them. Because just because they have a farm market doesn't mean that they're necessarily organic. And by the way, I want to mention this for sure. It is, in my opinion, illegal, immoral, totally semantically wrong to call anything organic anymore, because 75% of all the rain that falls in this country has Roundup in it. And once Roundup has fallen on it out of the rain, it ain't organic.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Shealy. It's really sad. In fact, I've discussed many an article of many a company who bragged and pound their chest about how GMO and safe their products are, and then that we found out later that they were not. So you really, like you say, you never know what you're getting. You never know if you're getting poison from Roundup chemicals, or you never know if you're getting, heck, you don't ever know what kind of spray the farmer has put in their soil.
And let's face it, we haven't discussed the most toxic thing in the country today, which is fluoridated water. It may be even worse long-term than the Roundup.
Yeah, and it's often related to cancer, and it's a main ingredient in some rat poisons. Even China labels it as a pesticide, which is fluoride, and it's been known to make women sterile.
And men, by the way, the sperm count has decreased from 150 million to 40 million, and when it gets to 20 million, we are infertile.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunately everything's being forced on us, and even population is not being done on a volunteer basis, and it's making everybody sick. Life expectancy is dropping. You know, everybody talks about gluten intolerant. That's like the big term. Oh, I don't eat that because it's got gluten in it. Well, there's a lot of these people don't do the reading and research to know that there's hundreds of geoengineered proteins out there, mostly meant to increase shelf life and make us sicker at the same time. Can you talk about this so-called gluten intolerant phase and all the other geoengineered proteins that's been geoengineered in the laboratory and not in nature, Dr. Shealy?
Well, I would prefer, if possible, to avoid them. When I buy my seeds, I try to find a company that provides me with guaranteed non-GMO. Genetic modification is as evil as tobacco and fluoride in the dental industry and the AMA and the government all combined.
Dr. Shealy, your opinion, what is your opinion of iodine today and certain qualities that you recommend?
Well, we need a little bit of iodine. Every cell in your body needs iodine to have energy. We don't need a lot. We need actually about 1,500 1.5 milligrams a day. So if you multiply that by 7, that's, just over 10 milligrams a day. I personally prefer a pill called Iodoral, Iodoral. That's 12.5 milligrams. So it's not an excess. But if you take too much iodine, it actually blocks your thyroid. But actually, at least 75 or 80% of Americans are hypothyroid because of fluoridated water, as well as lack of iodine.
All right, Dr. Shealy, pardon me, but I am literally going upstairs. Pardon the sound, everybody, but are you there, Dr. Shealy?
Yeah, I'm here. What happened?
All right. I had to switch phones because the battery on my phone was dying. I got that infamous beep.
Right.
So I ran upstairs and switched phones. So pardon me, everybody, if you heard that terrible nail screeching blackboard sound. All right. Regarding, we hear a lot about amino acids and essential amino acids. What's your opinion on amino acids, Dr. Shealy?
Well, they are critical. You could live on protein with no fat, although I like a little bit of fat, and no carbohydrate, because you can make carbohydrate or glucose out of protein. So we definitely need a broad range of amino acids. And there's some that are not considered essential, but conditionally required or almost essential. And the big one there is taurine. The amino acid taurine is necessary for the nervous system, for the eyes and the heart. And there is not 1 microgram of taurine in any vegetable product.
Now, Doctor, going back to iodine a little bit, because I was on the run going upstairs, I'm hearing a lot more about thyroid complications and gallbladder complications. And and some people are pointing almost exclusively to the lack of iodine. What is your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, there's no question about it. The American diet is deficient in iodine. Our soil does not have iodine in it. Only people who eat a lot of ocean fish can get iodine out of nature.
Okay. Well, we'll be back with Dr. Norm Shealy after the break, everybody. Last segment of the morning coming up. We'll be right back. And we are in our last segment of the program. Dr. Shealy, you mentioned glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup. And there's an EPA report that says glyphosate may harm and even kill over 90% of endangered species. Now, unless this is a massive depopulation effort, which is very obvious, why would these people from the Monsantos, which is now Bayer, not only have liability immunity, be protected by Congress, but how can this be allowed in this world, Dr. Shealy?
Well, like all other nonsense, it's part of government. The fact that it's government doesn't mean that it's common sense or even any kind of sense. And the fact that government excludes an evil company like von Satan, and Bayer, of course, was a great financial support for Adolf Hitler, so it's even worse than von Satan was. I don't know. I can't answer in uncertainty and insanity.
Well, you're right. It's very hard to trust the powers that be, the government, the experts, because they're all bought and paid for or threatened and blackmailed. Here we have an article, CDC to suspend data collection for 20 through 21 flu season amid rising COVID-19 deaths, causing all flu deaths to be counted as COVID, which we talked about earlier. And even in Ontario, a top health official was caught on a hot mic prior to the COVID briefing saying, I quote, "I just say whatever they write down for me," unquote. So it's very difficult, Dr. Shealy, to trust any of these so-called experts if science and healthcare is all bought and paid for. Dr. Shealy.
Nonsense is still nonsense.
Now, Dr. Shealy, regarding all the, the red dye in today's meats, meats grown in a lab, meats grown in bioreactors, meats grown in space. I mean, some of the things I've read. And this is sold in restaurants, and this is sold in grocery stores. It's no big deal. Steroids, hormones, antibiotics, GMOs, estrogen mimickers, pesticides, cloning livestock. How does this all affect? We know it's for the benefit of shelf life in the field, and everything's pretty much processed today. But how does this affect, especially in the form of bioavailability regarding our gut? When you have all these modified proteins and enzymes and pesticides and all these things that we've talked about, how does it affect the absorption of the nutrients, the excretion, the metabolism, and the overall homeostasis in our body regarding our gut, Dr. Shealy?
It's mild to moderate poison. It's that simple. It's not real. It's artificial, and it's junk, and it's not good for you. One of the reasons I live on a farm, so I can raise my own, or have raised my own meat.
It's a shame that all these compromised nutritional, all this value, all the process, everything's covered up. In fact, so much corruption that there's cover-ups for the cover-ups right now. And it is quite sad. And, I tell everybody to not buy even old farmland. Keep away from flat ground, because odds are it was a pasture. Odds are it had chemicals on the soil that's even affected the water table purification process. I tell people to create their own compost. Every eggshell, every piece of straw from your animals and your chickens, every tomato stem, everything that rots in your fridge, if it does. I have goats and chickens and dogs, so it's not like anything goes to waste here. But I create my own compost. Do you have any words of wisdom on that, Dr. Shealy?
Well, I've lived on my current farm for 37 and a half years, and I compost all the time. And obviously that I don't have to add any fertilizer because I use compost.
I have a pretty good-sized garden here myself, and I really enjoy everything in nature, and especially gardening. And there's certain vegetables that I let go to seed. like spinach and things like that, so I don't have to plant the next year. I just get my natural heirloom seeds. Any other recommendations you have for that theory, Doctor?
Well, I honestly have to admit I do not collect my own seeds. I do get new seeds every year. I probably should convert and even raise my own seeds, but I'll have to think about that. It requires care.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Shealy, again, thank you for your expert advice. It's always a pleasure and an honor to interview you. Have a great day, sir.
Mutual, and happy New Year.
Same to you.